Every divorced father knows the hollow ache of picking up his children for the weekend, wondering if he's failed them before they even get in the car. Jack Harmon felt that familiar weight in his chest as he stood before the crumbling Victorian house on Maple Street, his 8-year-old twins, Ben and Lily, clutching his hands. He'd bought this run-down place with his last savings, hoping that sweat and determination could rebuild what his marriage couldn't hold together. The house needed everything: new floors, fresh paint, working plumbing, but Jack saw it as their chance to create something beautiful together. What he didn't expect was that this old house had been keeping a secret for over 60 years. As they started tearing up the rotted kitchen floorboards, little Ben's hammer broke through to reveal something that would change their lives forever. But what could possibly be hidden beneath those old wooden boards that had the power to heal a broken family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Harmon had never imagined his life would come to this, standing in the doorway of a house that looked like it had been abandoned by hope itself. The divorce papers were barely 6 months old, but they felt like a lifetime of failure folded into legal documents. His construction business had crumbled along with his marriage, a casualty of late nights, missed dinners, and the slow erosion of trust that comes when two people forget how to talk to each other. The Victorian house on Maple Street had been a foreclosure, sitting empty for 3 years before Jack scraped together enough money to make an offer the bank couldn't refuse. $28,000 for a house that had probably been worth 10 times that in its prime. Now, as he watched Ben and Lily explore their new weekend home, he wondered if he'd bought them a dream or a nightmare. "Dad, there's no carpet anywhere," Lily observed, her voice echoing in the empty living room. She had her mother's practical nature, always cataloguing problems before possibilities. Her twin brother Ben was different. He saw adventure where she saw work. "That's because we get to pick out new carpet together," Jack said, kneeling down to their level. "Or maybe hardwood floors. What do you think?" Ben was already running his small hands along the wall, fascinated by the faded wallpaper that peeled at the corners like old skin. "This house is really old, isn't it, Dad?" "Built in 1962, Jack replied, pulling out the folder of documents he'd been carrying like a lifeline. "That makes it older than Grandpa Joe when he taught me how to use tools." The mention of his father brought a familiar ache. Joe Harmon had been a master carpenter who could make wood sing under his hands. He'd died 2 years before the twins were born, but his worn leather toolbox sat in Jack's truck, waiting to bridge another generation. Jack had learned everything about building from his father, except, apparently, how to build a marriage that lasted. "Can we see our rooms?" Lily asked, practical as always. Jack led them up the creaking staircase, testing each step before letting them follow. The house groaned and settled around them, like an old man getting comfortable in his chair. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms opened off a central hallway, each with tall windows that had once offered views of well-tended gardens. "This one's mine," Ben declared, running into the room that faced the backyard. Afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that needed new glass, casting geometric patterns on the scuffed hardwood floor. Lily chose the room next door, smaller but with a window seat that looked out toward the street. "I can watch for you when you come to pick us up," she said quietly, and Jack's heart clenched at the unspoken assumption that he wouldn't be staying. "Actually," Jack said, sitting down on the window seat beside her, "I was thinking maybe I could stay here too. Fix the place up, make it our home for when you visit." The twins exchanged one of those silent conversations that 8-year-olds perfected, a language of glances and slight nods that excluded the adult world. "Mom says you don't have anywhere else to live," Ben said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "That's partly true," Jack admitted, "but mostly I want to build something with you two, something that's just ours." They spent the afternoon exploring the house room by room, Jack making notes on a yellow legal pad while the twins called out discoveries. The kitchen was a disaster, cabinets hanging askew, linoleum curled at the edges, a sink that had given up trying to drain properly. The bathroom upstairs had working water but questionable plumbing. The basement smelled like old newspapers and forgotten dreams. But there were also surprises. Beautiful crown molding in the dining room, a bay window in the living room that would flood the space with morning light once the plywood was removed. Hardwood floors throughout that might shine again with enough work and patience. As evening approached, Jack made dinner on a camping stove he'd brought in a cooler. They sat on the living room floor eating sandwiches and chips, the twins chattering about their plans for decorating their rooms. "Dad," Lily said suddenly, "why didn't you and Mom want to live in the same house anymore?" The question hung in the air like dust motes in the fading light. Jack had been dreading this conversation and preparing for it in equal measure. "Sometimes grown-ups forget how to be happy together," he said carefully. "Your mum and I both love you more than anything in the world, but we couldn't figure out how to love each other the way we used to." "Because you work too much," Ben said matter-of-factly. "That was part of it," Jack acknowledged. "I thought I was working hard to take care of our family, but I was actually working so much that I forgot to spend time with the family I was trying to take care of." "Are you going to work too much now?" Lily asked. Jack looked around the room that would need new drywall, fresh paint, and probably electrical work before it felt like home. "I'm going to work hard on this house," he said, "but only when you're here to help me. Deal?" The twins considered this with the seriousness of contract negotiators. "Deal," they said in unison. As they cleaned up their makeshift dinner, a gentle knock came at the front door. Jack opened it to find an elderly Asian woman holding a covered casserole dish. "I'm Margaret Chen," she said with a slight accent that spoke of careful pronunciation. "I live next door. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." "Jack Harmon," he replied, accepting the warm dish gratefully. "These are my children, Ben and Lily." Mrs. Chen's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth as she looked at the twins. "This house has been quiet for too long. It needs the sound of children again." "Did you know the people who lived here before?" Lily asked, her curiosity always leading her conversations. Something flickered across Mrs. Chen's face so quickly that Jack almost missed it. "A long time ago," she said carefully. "They were good people. I hope you'll be happy here." After she left, Jack found himself standing in the doorway, watching her walk back to her neat bungalow next door. There had been something in her voice when she mentioned the previous owners, a weight that spoke of stories left untold. "Dad, can we sleep here tonight?" Ben asked, interrupting Jack's thoughts. Jack looked around the empty house, with its questionable heating and uncertain plumbing. Every reasonable part of his mind said it was too soon, too risky, too much like the impulsive decisions that had helped destroy his marriage. But when he saw the hope in his children's faces, the eagerness to claim this place as theirs, he found himself nodding. "We'll need sleeping bags," he said, "and we should probably check that the heat works." They made a quick trip to the nearby Walmart, returning with sleeping bags, battery-powered lanterns, and enough snacks to survive a weekend camping trip. As they set up their makeshift beds in the living room, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply getting through each day. The house settled around them as darkness fell, creaking and sighing like an old friend getting comfortable. Jack lay awake long after the twins had drifted off to sleep, listening to the sounds of his new home and thinking about the work ahead. His father's toolbox waited in the truck, filled with instruments of creation and repair. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work of transformation, not just of the house, but of themselves. The morning brought autumn sunshine streaming through windows that needed cleaning, and Jack woke to find Ben already awake, sketching plans for his room on the back of a fast food napkin. Lily was still curled in her sleeping bag, but her eyes were open, watching dust motes dance in the golden light. "Morning, architects," Jack said, stretching muscles that protested sleeping on a hardwood floor. "Ready to see what this old place really looks like in daylight." The daylight inspection was both encouraging and daunting. The house had good bones, solid foundation, straight walls, a roof that needed work but wasn't catastrophic. But every room revealed new challenges. The kitchen cabinets were held together more by habit than hardware. The bathroom upstairs had a window that wouldn't close and a medicine cabinet that hung at a precarious angle. "This is going to take forever," Lily said, though her tone suggested she found the prospect exciting rather than discouraging. "Good thing we have forever," Jack replied, pulling out his father's toolbox for the first time since the divorce. The familiar weight of the worn leather case in his hands brought back memories of Saturday mornings spent learning the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, the satisfaction of a joint that fit perfectly, the quiet pride in his father's voice when Jack mastered a new skill. The twins gathered around as he opened the toolbox, revealing tools that had built dozens of houses over 3 decades. Each implement had its place, worn smooth by hands that had known exactly how to use them. "Grandpa Joe's tools," Ben said reverently. He had only vague memories of his grandfather, but Jack had told them stories about the man who could make anything out of wood and determination. "Now there are tools," Jack said, handing Ben a small hammer that had been his first when he was about the same age. "But we use them carefully, and we use them together." They started with the simplest project, removing the damaged kitchen cabinets. Jack showed the twins how to turn off the water supply, how to disconnect the plumbing connections, how to remove screws that had been painted over so many times they had become part of the wood. "Why are we taking everything apart before we put it back together?" Lily asked, her logical mind seeking patterns in the apparent destruction. "Sometimes," Jack said, prying loose a cabinet that had been installed with more enthusiasm than skill, "you have to see what you're really working with before you can make it better. These cabinets look like they're attached to the wall, but really they're just covering up problems." As if to prove his point, the removal of the lower cabinets revealed water damage that had rotted the drywall behind the sink. The discovery was disheartening but not unexpected. "Is the whole house broken?" Ben asked, poking at the soft, damaged wall with his finger. "No," Jack said, though privately he wondered how much damage they would uncover as they dug deeper. "Think of it like surgery. We have to fix the sick parts before we can make the healthy parts stronger." The work was slower with 8-year-old helpers, but Jack found himself grateful for their presence. They asked questions he wouldn't have thought to answer, noticed details he might have overlooked, and brought an energy to the project that reminded him why he had fallen in love with building in the first place. Mrs. Chen appeared at the back door around noon, carrying a thermos of hot coffee and a plate of homemade cookies. "Thought you might need refreshments," she said, settling into a kitchen chair that Jack had managed to salvage from the demolition. "This is very kind of you," Jack said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The twins immediately gravitated toward the cookies, which appeared to be chocolate chip with something extra that made them taste like childhood memories. "I've been watching the house for years," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes scanning the damage they had uncovered, waiting for the right family to bring it back to life. "Have there been other people interested in buying it?" Jack asked. Something passed across Mrs. Chen's face again, that same shadow he had noticed the night before. A few inquiries over the years, but no one who seemed right for the house. "What makes us right?" Lily asked, her direct approach cutting through adult politeness. Mrs. Chen smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "This house needs people who understand that some things are worth saving, even when they seem broken beyond repair." After she left, Jack found himself wondering about her choice of words. There had been an intentionality to her phrasing that suggested she meant more than just the physical structure of the house. The afternoon brought their first real success. Working together, they managed to remove all the damaged cabinetry and clean up the debris. The kitchen looked worse than when they started: bare walls, exposed plumbing, a floor that revealed the full extent of the water damage, but it also looked honest. No more hiding behind facades that had been covering up problems. "It looks terrible," Lily observed. "It looks like it's ready for us to make it better," Jack corrected, and realized he was talking about more than just the kitchen. As evening approached, they drove back to the apartment Jack was renting week to week, the twins chattering excitedly about their plans for the house. But Jack found his mind drifting back to Mrs. Chen's comments, to the way she had looked at the house, as if she were keeping watch over more than just an empty building. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep on the air mattresses that served as their weekend beds, Jack sat at his laptop, researching the history of 1247 Maple Street. The county records were sparse, built in 1962 by Morrison Construction, sold to Harold and Patricia Morrison in the same year, owned by the Morrison family until 1970, when it had been sold to the bank. 8 years of family ownership, then nearly 40 years of rental properties and gradual decline. Jack wondered what had happened to the Morrisons, why they had sold a house they had just built. But the records offered no answers, and Jack told himself it didn't matter. The house's past was less important than its future. He had no way of knowing how wrong he was, or that the house had been waiting 60 years for someone with the skills to uncover what had been deliberately hidden. The toolbox that had belonged to his father would become the key to unlocking secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about building, about family, and about the price of doing what's right. All he knew that night was that for the first time since the divorce, he felt like he was moving toward something instead of running away from it. And that was enough to let him sleep soundly, dreaming of hammers and saws and the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that would soon be filled with light. The following weekend brought unseasonably warm weather that made working in the house feel less like endurance and more like possibility. Jack had spent the week researching kitchen renovations and pricing materials, trying to balance his shrinking bank account with his growing list of necessary repairs. "Today, we're going to learn about demolition," he announced to Ben and Lily as they stood in the gutted kitchen, morning light streaming through windows that desperately needed new glass. "We already know about demolition," Ben said, gesturing at the bare walls around them. "We're good at breaking stuff." "Controlled demolition," Jack corrected with a smile. "There's a difference between breaking things and taking them apart the right way." He handed them each a pair of safety glasses that were comically large on their small faces, then demonstrated how to use a pry bar to remove baseboards without damaging the walls behind them. The twins took turns, their concentration intense as they worked to master the technique. It was Ben who made the discovery that would change everything. He had been working on a section of baseboard near the old refrigerator space, prying carefully at the painted wood, when his small pry bar slipped and punched through the drywall behind it. "Oops," he said, looking at Jack with the expression of a child who wasn't sure if he was in trouble. "It's okay," Jack said, kneeling down to examine the hole. "Sometimes you have to break a few things to—" He stopped mid-sentence. There was something in the wall cavity, something that caught the light from his flashlight and gleamed gold. "What is it, Dad?" Lily asked, crowding close to see. Jack reached into the hole, his fingers closing around something small and metallic. When he pulled his hand out, he was holding an old brass key, tarnished with age but still solid and well-made. The twins stared at the key with the fascination that children reserved for genuine mysteries. "Where did it come from?" Ben asked, taking the key from Jack's palm and turning it over in the morning light. "Someone must have dropped it inside the wall during construction," Jack said, though even as he spoke, he wondered. The key looked deliberate, placed rather than dropped. Keys like this usually open something important. "Like a treasure chest," Lily said, her practical nature momentarily overwhelmed by possibility. "Maybe," Jack said, though his mind was already cataloguing the locks in the house they had yet to explore. "Let's see if we can figure out what it opens." They spent the next hour testing the key on every lock they could find. The front door, the back door, the basement door that had been painted shut for decades. None of them fit. The key was too small for the exterior doors, too large for most of the interior hardware. "Maybe it opens something that's not in the house anymore," Ben suggested as they sat on the front porch steps, stumped by their failure to solve the mystery. Or maybe, Lily said with the logic of someone who read mystery novels above her grade level, it opens something that's hidden. Jack looked at his daughter with new respect. That's good thinking. What makes you say that? If you hide a key inside a wall, you're probably hiding it because you don't want just anyone to find it. And if you don't want just anyone to find the key, then whatever it opens is probably hidden too. The search for hidden locks became the day's obsession. They examined every piece of furniture that had been left in the house, every cabinet that still had doors, every drawer that hadn't been removed. Ben discovered that the key almost fit the lock on an old writing desk in what had been the living room, but not quite. It was while they were examining the desk more closely that Lily made the second discovery of the day. "Dad, look at this," she said, running her fingers along the wood paneling on the wall behind the desk. Jack came over to see what had caught her attention. At first, he saw only the same tired paneling that covered most of the downstairs walls. But as Lily traced a pattern with her finger, he began to see what she had noticed. Carved lightly into the wood, almost invisible unless the light hit it just right, were letters and numbers. SM 1968. Safe. SM. Ben read aloud. What does that mean? Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. He thought about Mrs. Chen's reaction when Lily had asked about the previous owners, the careful way she had chosen her words. "I think we need to do some research," he said quietly. The Millbrook Public Library was a 15-minute drive from the house, a brick building that had served the community since the 1940s. Jack had fond memories of bringing the twins there when they were younger, before the divorce had divided even their simple traditions into his weekends and her weekdays. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who had helped them find picture books when the twins were 4, greeted them with surprised pleasure. "Jack Harmon, I haven't seen you folks in ages. How are you, Ben and Lily?" "We're fixing up an old house," Ben said with the excitement of someone who had discovered a new passion. "And we found a mystery." Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a librarian presented with a research challenge. "What kind of mystery?" Jack explained about the house, the key, and the carved initials. Mrs. Patterson listened with growing interest, then led them to a section of the library. Jack had never explored the local history collection. "If your house was built in 1962, we should be able to find records of the original owners," she said, pulling out a thick binder labeled Millbrook Property Records 1,961,970. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. The Morrison family had indeed built and owned 1,247 Maple Street. Harold Morrison, his wife Patricia, and their children Sarah and Michael. Sarah Morrison, S.M. "Can we find out what happened to them?" Lily asked, her mystery novel instincts in full gear. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious. "Let me check the newspaper archives," she said, moving to another section of the collection. The newspaper archive was kept on microfilm, and Mrs. Patterson showed Jack how to operate the reader while the twins peered over his shoulder at the screen. They started with 1970, the year the house had been sold, and worked backward. They found the story in the October 15, 1969 edition of the Millbrook Gazette. "Local family missing. Police are searching for Harold Morrison, 34, his wife Patricia, 32, and their children Sarah, 10, and Michael, 8, who have not been seen since October 10th. Morrison, an accountant with Henderson Construction, failed to report to work on Monday. Neighbors became concerned when the family's car remained in the driveway, and mail began accumulating. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Millbrook Police Department. Jack felt the twins go very still beside him as he read the article aloud. "What happened to them?" Ben asked in a small voice. Jack continued searching through subsequent editions, but the follow-up stories offered no answers. The search continued for several weeks, then faded from the news. The Morrison family had simply vanished, leaving behind a house, a life, and questions that were never answered. "That's really sad," Lily said quietly. "Yes, it is," Jack agreed, though his mind was racing with implications he didn't want to share with the children. A missing accountant, a hidden key, carved initials that included the word safe. The pieces suggested a story that was darker than simple disappearance. They drove home in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the Morrison family and the house that had once been their home. Jack found himself wondering what had happened in those rooms where his children now played. What fear or desperation had driven someone to hide a key inside a wall? As they pulled into the driveway, Mrs. Chen emerged from her house, as if she had been watching for their return. "Find anything interesting at the library?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Jack looked at her more carefully, noting the way she kept glancing at the house, the tension in her shoulders that spoke of long-held secrets. "We learned about the Morrison family," he said carefully. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "They were good people. They deserved better." "Mrs. Chen," Jack said, "did you know them?" For a long moment, she was silent. Then she looked at Ben and Lily, who were watching the conversation with the intense focus of children who sensed adult secrets. "I knew Sarah," she said finally. "She was my friend, before they went away." The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations, and Jack could see questions forming in their eyes that he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Mrs. Chen," Lily said with the directness that was her trademark, "do you think they're coming back?" Mrs. Chen's expression grew infinitely sad. "No, sweetheart, I don't think they're coming back. But I think maybe they left something behind, something important." She looked meaningfully at the brass key that Ben was still carrying in his pocket. "Some things," she said quietly, "are hidden because they need to stay safe until the right person finds them." As she walked back to her house, Jack realized that their weekend renovation project had become something much more complex. The house wasn't just offering them a chance to build something new, it was asking them to uncover something old, something that had been waiting in the walls for someone with the tools and the courage to find it. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Jack sat in the empty living room, holding the brass key and thinking about 10-year-old Sarah Morrison, who had carved her initials into the wall with a message about something safe. Whatever she had hidden, she had trusted that someday someone would find the key and understand what it meant. The weight of that trust settled on Jack's shoulders like a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Tomorrow they would continue their search, not just for whatever the key opened, but for answers to questions that had been waiting 30 years to be asked. The week between visits felt longer than usual. Jack found himself thinking about the Morrison family during his shifts at the temporary construction job he'd taken to pay for renovation supplies. Every time he used his tools, he wondered what Harold Morrison had been working on in his last days, what had made an accountant's family disappear without a trace. When Friday evening came, Jack picked up the twins with a trunk full of new supplies and a head full of questions he wasn't sure he should be asking. "Did you think about the key all week?" Ben asked before Jack had even pulled away from Sarah's house. "Every day," Jack admitted. "Did you?" "Lily drew pictures of what she thinks it might open," Ben reported. "Show him, Lily." Lily produced a notebook filled with sketches, treasure chests, secret doors, hidden rooms. Her artistic skill was impressive for an 8-year-old, but more than that, her imagination had clearly been captured by the mystery. "These are really good," Jack said, flipping through the pages. "You've been thinking about this scientifically." "Mom says you can solve any problem if you think about it long enough," Lily replied. "She also says you're good at finding things that other people miss." The compliment, delivered second-hand through his ex-wife, touched Jack more than he expected. Sarah had always been better at seeing his strengths than he was. Back at the house, they approached their search with new, systematic determination. Jack had spent time during the week researching the layout of houses built in the early 1960s, particularly those built by Morrison Construction. If Harold Morrison had hidden something in his own house, he would have chosen a location that was both secure and accessible. "We're going to search each room completely before moving to the next one," Jack explained as they stood in the living room with the carved wall panel. "Look for anything that seems out of place, any piece of furniture or fixture that doesn't match the others." They started with the living room itself. The paneling was original to the house, Jack determined, but some sections had been added or modified over the years. Working together, they mapped out which panels were load-bearing and which were purely decorative. It was while examining the baseboards that Lily made a connection. "Dad, look at this," she said, running her fingers along the baseboard near the carved message. "This piece is different wood than the others." Jack knelt down to examine what she had found. She was right. One section of baseboard appeared to be made from a different type of wood, stained to match but not quite successfully. "Good eye," he said, pulling out his flashlight for a closer look. "This section has been replaced." Working carefully with a thin pry bar, Jack loosened the replacement baseboard. Behind it, he found a small cavity that had been carved out of the wall stud, just large enough to hold something the size of a book. But the space was empty. "Someone already found it," Ben said, disappointed. "Or," Lily said thoughtfully, "someone moved it to a different hiding place." Jack sat back on his heels thinking, if Sarah Morrison had carved the message about something being safe, and if the original hiding place had been compromised, where would a smart 10-year-old move something important? "Let's keep looking," he said, "but first, let's see what else is in this room." They examined every piece of furniture that had been left behind. A heavy oak dining table with drawers that stuck, a china cabinet with glass doors that rattled when the wind blew, a rocking chair that had been painted and repainted so many times that Jack couldn't tell what the original wood had been. Behind the rocking chair, almost hidden in the corner where two walls met, Ben found something that made him call out in excitement. "Dad, Lily, come look at this." What he had discovered was a loose floorboard, so cunningly concealed that it would have been invisible if furniture had been sitting on top of it. Jack pried it up carefully, revealing another hiding space beneath. This one wasn't empty. Inside the floor cavity was a cloth bundle, carefully wrapped and preserved. Jack lifted it out with the reverence of someone handling a historical artifact, which, he realized, was exactly what this was. "What is it?" Lily whispered. Jack unwrapped the cloth to reveal a family photograph in a silver frame, the same photograph they had seen in the newspaper archive, but in much better condition. Harold and Patricia Morrison stood behind their children, Sarah and Michael, all four of them smiling at the camera with the easy happiness of people who believed their future was secure. But it was what was tucked behind the photograph that made Jack's breath catch. A folded piece of paper, covered in a child's careful handwriting. "Can we read it?" Ben asked. Jack unfolded the paper carefully. The ink had faded, but was still legible. At the top, in neat cursive letters, it said, "For whoever finds this, Sarah Morrison, age 10, September 1969. Jack read the letter aloud. "If you are reading this, something bad happened to my family. Daddy has been very scared lately. He found out about some bad things at his work, and he says some bad men might try to hurt us because of what he knows. He made me promise that if something happened, I would hide his important papers somewhere safe until someone good could find them. I moved them from the wall because Daddy said the bad men might look there. I put them in the most important place in our house, the place where our family was happiest. Look for the place where we kept our treasures. Daddy says the truth is more important than being safe. He says someday someone will need to know what really happened. I hope whoever finds this will help my family, even if we can't be helped anymore. Sarah Morrison. September 15, 1969. The silence that followed Jack's reading was heavy with the weight of a child's faith and a family's tragedy. She knew something bad was going to happen, Lily said quietly. And she was trying to help, even though she was just a kid like us, Ben added. Jack folded the letter carefully, his mind racing. Sarah Morrison had been the same age as his twins when she wrote this letter, and she had shown more courage and foresight than many adults would have managed. Dad, Lily said, we have to find what she hid, don't we? Jack looked at his children, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had driven Sarah Morrison to write her letter. The practical part of his mind warned him that they were getting involved in something that might be dangerous, something that had apparently cost a family their lives. But the father in him, the part that had learned about right and wrong from Joe Harmon's patient lessons, knew that some responsibilities couldn't be ignored. Yes, he said, we have to find it. Where do you think she hid it? Ben asked. Jack read the letter again, focusing on Sarah's clues. The most important place in our house, the place where our family was happiest. Look for the place where we kept our treasures. Every family has a different place like that, Lily observed. For some families, it might be the kitchen table, or maybe their parents' bedroom. Or, Jack said, thinking about the layout of the house, maybe a place where the whole family spent time together. They spent the rest of the afternoon examining the house with new eyes, looking for spaces that would have been central to family life in the late 1960s. The living room, obviously, but they had already searched it thoroughly. The kitchen, but most of it had been gutted in their renovation efforts. It was as they were standing in the hallway between the upstairs bedrooms that Jack had a realization. The bathroom, he said suddenly. The bathroom? Ben looked skeptical. Think about it, Jack explained. In 1969, most houses only had one bathroom. Every member of the family would have used it every day. And bathrooms often have built-in storage, places where families keep things they use regularly. Contention. The upstairs bathroom was small and dated, with a medicine cabinet that hung crookedly and a bathtub that showed its age in rust stains and chipped enamel. But as Jack examined it more closely, he began to see possibilities. The medicine cabinet was mounted on the wall between two studs, but the space behind it seemed larger than necessary for the depth of the cabinet itself. Working carefully, Jack removed the mounting screws and lifted the cabinet away from the wall. Behind it was a cavity that extended deep into the wall, much deeper than the standard construction would have required. And in that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved by 6 decades of dry storage, were the papers that Harold Morrison had died trying to protect. We found it, Lily breathed, as Jack carefully lifted the package from its hiding place. Sarah Morrison was a very smart girl, Jack said, unwrapping the oilcloth to reveal a manila envelope stuffed with documents. Inside the envelope were dozens of papers, financial records, photographs, correspondence, and what appeared to be architectural plans for various construction projects around Millbrook. But it was the letter paper clipped to the front of the collection that caught Jack's immediate attention. In Harold Morrison's careful handwriting, it read, "To whoever finds these documents, my name is Harold Morrison, and I fear that my family and I are in grave danger because of what I have discovered about corruption in the Millbrook construction industry and city government. If something happens to us, please ensure that these documents reach the proper authorities. The people of this town deserve to know the truth." The letter was dated October 8, 1969, just 2 days before the Morrison family had disappeared. Jack looked at the twins, who were watching him with wide eyes that held both excitement and the dawning realization of what they had uncovered. "This is bigger than just a missing family, isn't it?" Lily asked. Jack nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications of what they had found. Harold Morrison hadn't just been an accountant who had stumbled onto something dangerous. He had been a man who had chosen to document corruption even when he knew it might cost him everything. And now, 30 years later, his evidence was in the hands of another father who would have to decide how far he was willing to go to honor the trust of a 10-year-old girl who had believed that someday someone good would find what her family had died protecting. Jack spent the evening after the twins had gone to sleep studying Harold Morrison's documents by lamplight in the empty living room. What he found was a meticulous record of fraud, bribery, and corruption that reached into every level of Millbrook's government and business community. Morrison had been more than just an accountant for Henderson Construction. He had been a man with a conscience who had started noticing irregularities in the company's books. Projects that were billed to the city for twice their actual cost. Materials that were charged as premium but delivered as standard grade. Safety inspections that were passed without inspectors ever visiting job sites. But it was the photographs that made Jack's blood run cold. Pictures of construction sites where corners had been cut so severely that the buildings would be dangerous to occupy. A school foundation that had been poured with substandard concrete, a hospital wing that had been built with electrical wiring that wouldn't meet even 1,960 safety codes. Harold Morrison had documented everything, and in his careful notes, Jack could see the evolution of a man who had realized that his discovery was bigger than simple embezzlement. People's lives were at stake. The names in the documents were ones that Jack recognized from his research into the town's history. Mayor Richard Brennan, Police Chief Thomas Kelly, the Henderson family, who had owned the largest construction company in 3 counties. All of them, according to Morrison's evidence, had been part of a conspiracy that had prioritized profit over safety for decades. Jack closed the manila envelope and sat back in the darkness, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had inherited. A missing family, evidence of crimes that might still be affecting people today, and the trust of a 10-year-old girl who had believed that the truth was more important than being safe. When the twins returned the following weekend, Jack had made his decision. "We need to talk about what we found," he said as they sat in the kitchen, eating breakfast off paper plates. "The documents that Sarah Morrison hid are evidence of some very serious crimes. Are the bad men still around?" Ben asked with the directness of childhood. "Some of them might be," Jack said honestly, "which means we need to be very careful about what we do next." Lily was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "What would happen if we just pretended we never found anything?" It was a fair question, and Jack had wrestled with it all week. The practical answer was that they could repack the documents, put them back in their hiding place, and continue their renovation, as if the Morrison family's story was none of their business. "We could do that," Jack said, "but then Sarah Morrison's trust in us would be wasted, and people who might be getting hurt by the same kind of corruption would continue to be hurt. But if we do something about it, we might get in trouble too," Lily observed. "That's possible," Jack acknowledged, "but sometimes doing the right thing involves accepting some risk." The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations, and Jack could see them weighing the possibilities with the seriousness that the situation deserved. "What if we tried to find out more before we decide?" Ben suggested. "Like detectives do." Jack felt a surge of pride in his son's logical thinking. "What kind of things do you think we should find out?" "Whether any of the bad men are still alive," Lily said immediately, "and whether they're still doing bad things, and whether anyone else has tried to find out what happened to the Morrison family," Ben added. Jack nodded. "Those are very good questions, and I think I know where we can start looking for answers." They spent the morning in a different kind of renovation work, turning the living room into a research center. Jack had brought his laptop and a portable printer, and they spread Harold Morrison's documents across the floor, organizing them by date and category. "Look at this," Lily said, holding up a photograph that showed a construction site with several men in suits, examining blueprints. "One of these people might still live here." Jack examined the photograph more closely. The men were identified on the back in Harold Morrison's careful handwriting: Henderson, Brennan, Kelly, and Walsh, examining plans for Millbrook Elementary expansion, May 1969. Let's see if any of these names are in the current phone book, Jack suggested. The Millbrook phone directory was thin enough to search by hand, and it didn't take long to find what they were looking for. No Hendersons or Kellys, but there were 3 Walshes and 2 Brennans. Edward Brennan, Lily read from the phone book. Do you think that could be Mayor Brennan's son? Could be, Jack said. Let's see what else we can find out. They spent the afternoon at the library again, but this time Jack's approach was more systematic. If some of the people involved in the corruption were still alive, there might be traces of their continued influence in public records, newspaper articles, or city documents. What they found was disturbing. Edward Brennan was indeed the son of the former mayor, and he currently served on the city council. Walsh Construction, presumably connected to the Walsh in the photograph, was still one of the largest contractors in the area, having taken over many of Henderson Construction's former projects after that company had quietly disbanded in 1970. It's like they just changed the names but kept doing the same things, Ben observed with the clarity that children often brought to adult deceptions. That's exactly what it looks like, Jack agreed. But it was the newspaper archives that provided the most troubling information. Over the past 30 years, Millbrook had experienced an unusual number of structural failures in public buildings. A school gymnasium roof that had collapsed during a storm in 1985. A bridge that had been closed indefinitely in 1992 due to structural concerns. A city office building that had been evacuated in 1998 because of foundation problems. Each incident had been explained as isolated problems, but Harold Morrison's documents suggested a different pattern: buildings that had been compromised from the moment they were constructed. Time bombs waiting to fail when age and weather stressed their deliberately weakened structures. People could have been hurt, Lily said quietly as they read about the gymnasium collapse. People probably have been hurt, Jack corrected, thinking about accidents and injuries that might have been attributed to bad luck rather than criminal negligence. As they drove home that evening, Jack found himself thinking about his responsibility as a father and as a citizen. The Morrison family had paid the ultimate price for trying to expose corruption that was still harming people decades later. Sarah Morrison had trusted that someday someone would find her father's evidence and act on it. But acting on it meant accepting the risk that the same people who had silenced the Morrison family might try to silence anyone else who threatened their secrets. Back at the house, as the twins explored their bedrooms and made plans for decorating, Jack stood in the kitchen, looking at the holes in the wall where they had found the first clues to the mystery. The renovation that had started as a way to rebuild his relationship with his children had become something much more complex, a test of the values he wanted to pass on to them. That evening, after the twins had fallen asleep in their sleeping bags, Jack called the one person he thought might be able to give him advice about what to do next. "Sarah," he said when his ex-wife answered the phone, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust that I have good reasons for asking." "What's wrong?" Sarah's voice immediately shifted to the concerned tone she used when she sensed trouble. "If you found evidence that some very bad people had hurt a family, and that the same people might still be hurting other families, what would you do?" There was a long pause. "Jack, what have you gotten yourself into?" "I can't explain everything over the phone," Jack said. "But I need to know, do you think it's ever right to put your own family at risk in order to protect other families?" Another pause, longer this time. Then Sarah said, "I think you already know what the right thing to do is. And I think you're calling me because you need someone to tell you it's okay to be scared while you do it." Jack closed his eyes, feeling a surge of gratitude for the woman who had shared his life for 10 years and who still understood him better than he understood himself. "The kids could be in danger if I do what I think I need to do," he said quietly. "The kids are learning from you every day what it means to be a good person," Sarah replied. "Don't you think they deserve to see what it looks like when their father stands up for what's right?" After he hung up the phone, Jack sat in the darkness thinking about courage and responsibility, about the Morrison family and his own children, about the kind of man he wanted to be, and the kind of world he wanted his twins to inherit. Outside, Mrs. Chen's house was dark, but Jack had the feeling that she was awake too, waiting for him to make the decision that would determine whether Sarah Morrison's faith in the future had been justified. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between safety and justice, between protecting his own family and honoring the sacrifice of another family who had paid the ultimate price for believing that the truth was more important than being safe. The brass key lay on the kitchen counter, catching the streetlight from the window and gleaming like a promise that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Jack woke to the sound of hammering that wasn't coming from his own tools. Disoriented by sleep and the unfamiliar acoustics of the empty house, it took him a moment to realize that someone was pounding on the front door with enough force to rattle the windows. The digital clock on his phone showed 6:47 a.m. The twins were still asleep in their sleeping bags, curled together like puppies in the patch of morning sunlight that streamed through the living room windows. The hammering came again, more insistent this time. Jack pulled on his jeans and made his way to the front door, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. Had Mrs. Chen had an emergency? Was there a gas leak or some other neighborhood crisis? But when he opened the door, he found himself facing two men in expensive suits who looked like they had never done a day of manual labor in their lives. "Mr. Harmon?" The taller of the two men spoke with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "I'm David Walsh, from Walsh Construction. This is my associate, Mr. Brennan. We'd like to speak with you about your renovation project." Jack's blood went cold. Walsh Construction. Brennan. These were names from Harold Morrison's documents, families that had been part of the conspiracy 30 years ago. "It's pretty early for a business call," Jack said, not moving from the doorway. Walsh smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We heard you've been doing some interesting renovation work, uncovering some things that have been hidden for a long time." Behind him, Jack heard one of the twins stirring in their sleep. Every protective instinct he possessed flared to life. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said evenly. "Don't you?" Brennan spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat menace of someone accustomed to intimidating people. "We understand you've been spending a lot of time at the library, researching local history, asking questions about families that disappeared a long time ago." Jack's mind raced. How did they know about his research? The library visits had been innocent enough, but apparently someone had been paying attention. "I'm just trying to learn about the house I bought," Jack said. "Any homeowner would do the same thing." "Of course," Walsh agreed smoothly, "and we're here to help. We'd like to make you an offer for the property, well above what you paid for it. Enough to buy something much nicer, in a much better neighborhood. The house isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price," Brennan said. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000, cash. You could close by the end of the week." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. $50,000 was more than twice what he had paid for the house, money that would solve all his immediate financial problems and give him the fresh start he desperately needed. It was also obviously a bribe disguised as a business proposition. "I appreciate the offer," Jack said carefully, "but I'm not interested in selling. My children and I are happy here." The two men exchanged a glance that spoke of communications Jack couldn't hear, but could easily interpret. "Mr. Harmon," Walsh said, his voice losing its veneer of friendliness, "I think you should consider our offer very carefully. This house has a history of bringing bad luck to the families who live in it." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jack felt his hands clench into fists, the old reflexes of someone who had learned to defend himself surfacing despite the years of peaceful civilian life. "Are you threatening my family?" he asked quietly. "Not at all," Walsh said quickly. "We're simply concerned about your safety. Old houses can be dangerous. Structural problems, electrical issues, things that previous owners might have overlooked." "Dad!" Lily's voice came from behind him, small and worried. Who are those men? Jack turned to see both twins standing in the living room doorway. Their hair mussed from sleep, but their eyes alert with the instinctive wariness that children developed when they sensed adult tensions they didn't understand. Just some businessmen who wanted to discuss the house, Jack said, keeping his voice calm. Go get dressed. We'll have breakfast in a few minutes. But the twins didn't move. Ben was staring at the men with the intense focus he usually reserved for puzzles he was trying to solve, while Lily had stepped protectively closer to her brother. Walsh noticed the children's attention, and his expression softened into what was probably meant to be a friendly smile. Beautiful children, he said. They must love having such a big old house to explore. They do, Jack said firmly, and they're going to love it even more when we're finished fixing it up. Of course, Walsh agreed, though I hope you'll be careful during your renovations. Sometimes when people tear into old walls, they find things that are better left undisturbed. The message was clear enough that even the twins seemed to sense its meaning. Lily moved closer to Jack, while Ben's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching fear. I think this conversation is over, Jack said, starting to close the door. Brennan put his hand against the door frame, stopping it from closing. Think about our offer, Mr. Harmon. We'll give you until Monday to make your decision. There's nothing to think about, Jack replied, but Brennan continued as if he hadn't spoken. $50,000. Cash. No questions asked about anything you might have found while you've been renovating. The emphasis on the word renovating made it clear that they knew exactly what Jack had discovered. Someone had been watching the house, monitoring his activities, reporting back to people who had a vested interest in keeping the past buried. Monday, Walsh repeated as the two men turned to leave. We'll be in touch. Jack watched them walk to a black sedan parked at the curb, noting the license plate number and the way they both looked back at the house before driving away. Only when their car had disappeared around the corner did he close the door and turn to face his children. Dad, those were the bad men, weren't they? Ben asked, with the directness that Jack had come to both love and dread in his son. They might be connected to the bad men, Jack said carefully, but they can't hurt us as long as we're smart about what we do. What did they want? Lily asked. Jack sat down on the floor so he could look directly into their eyes. They wanted to buy our house for a lot of money, more money than it's worth. Why would they do that? Ben asked. Because they don't want us to find anything else that Sarah Morrison hid, and they definitely don't want us to tell anyone about what we've already found. The twins digested this information with the seriousness that the situation deserved. Are we going to sell the house? Lily asked quietly. Jack looked around the living room, where they had made so many discoveries, where they had started building something together that was more than just a renovation project. The thought of giving up now, of letting the Morrison family's sacrifice be meaningless, made him feel sick. No, he said firmly, we're not going to sell the house. Even though it might be dangerous? Ben asked. Especially because it might be dangerous, Jack replied. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is the thing that scares you the most. After breakfast, Jack made a phone call he had been dreading, but knew was necessary. Detective Martinez, this is Jack Harmon. You probably don't remember me, but we worked together about 8 years ago on the Riverside construction fraud case. There was a pause, then a warm chuckle on the other end of the line. Jack Harmon, I heard you left the force. What's got you calling old contacts? I need some advice about a situation I've stumbled into. Something that might be related to the case that got me out of police work in the first place. Another pause. This one, less comfortable. Can you be more specific? Jack looked at the twins, who were pretending to organize their art supplies while obviously listening to every word of his conversation. Not over the phone. Could we meet somewhere? I have some documents that I think you should see. Documents about what? About corruption in the Millbrook construction industry that goes back 30 years, and about a family that might have been killed because they tried to expose it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Jack wondered if the connection had been lost. Jack, Martinez said finally, are you sure you want to get back into this kind of thing? Last time it didn't work out so well for you. Jack thought about his failed marriage, his collapsed business, the years of doubt and self-recrimination that had followed his attempt to expose corruption in his own department. "I'm sure," he said, "some things are too important to walk away from, no matter what it costs." They arranged to meet that afternoon at a diner outside of town, away from any potential surveillance. Jack spent the morning making copies of Harold Morrison's most damning documents, storing the originals in a safe deposit box at the bank, and preparing the twins for the possibility that their weekend might involve more than renovation work. "Where are we going?" Lily asked as they got in the truck. "To meet a friend of mine who used to be a police detective, someone who might be able to help us figure out what to do with what we found." "Are we in trouble?" Ben asked. Jack considered the question seriously. "We're not in trouble for finding the truth. But the people who want to keep the truth hidden might try to make trouble for us. Like they did for the Morrison family. Maybe. But we have some advantages that the Morrison family didn't have." "Like what?" Lily asked. Jack smiled, feeling a surge of fierce protectiveness and determination. "Like the fact that we're not alone. And like the fact that 30 years later, there are more people who care about justice than there were when Harold Morrison was trying to fight corruption by himself." As they drove toward their meeting with Detective Martinez, Jack found himself thinking about the blood-stained floorboard that was waiting for them back at the house. He had planned to remove it as part of the renovation, to replace it with clean, new wood that wouldn't carry the weight of old tragedies. But now he realized that the stain was evidence, part of the story that Harold Morrison had died trying to tell. Some things shouldn't be painted over or replaced. Some things needed to be preserved as testimony to the truth, no matter how ugly that truth might be. The Morrison family had paid the ultimate price for their courage. The least Jack could do was make sure their sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. Even if it meant accepting that his own family might now be walking the same dangerous path that had led Sarah Morrison to write her letter and hide her father's secrets in the walls of a house that had kept its silence for 30 years. Detective Maria Martinez looked older than Jack remembered, her dark hair now streaked with silver and her eyes carrying the weight of too many cases that had ended badly. But when she smiled across the booth at Ruby's diner, Jack saw the same fierce intelligence that had made her the best detective he had ever worked with. "You look good, Jack," she said, though her tone suggested she was reserving judgment about his current situation. "Fatherhood suits you." Ben and Lily sat quietly beside Jack, coloring in activity books he had brought to keep them occupied while the adults talked. But Jack knew they were listening to every word, their young minds filing away information they would undoubtedly ask about later. "Thanks for meeting us on short notice," Jack said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "I need someone I trust to look at these documents and tell me if I'm crazy for thinking they're important." Martinez opened the envelope and began examining Harold Morrison's papers. Jack watched her expression change from polite interest to sharp attention to something approaching alarm as she read through the evidence that Morrison had compiled. "Jesus, Jack," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the twins couldn't hear. "Where did you find this?" "In the house I bought. The previous owner hid them before he and his family disappeared in 1969. "I know." Martinez looked up from the documents, her eyes searching Jack's face. "And you're sure these are authentic?" "I'm sure," Jack replied. "The question is, what do I do with them?" Martinez set the papers aside and picked up her coffee cup, using the time to think. Jack could see her mentally sorting through the implications of what she had just read. "Some of these names," she said finally, "are still connected to people who have significant power in this area. David Walsh, Edward Brennan, these families have been influential in local politics and construction for decades." "I know," Jack said. "Two men from those families visited me this morning. They offered to buy my house for $50,000. Cash, no questions asked." Martinez's expression sharpened. "They know you found the documents?" "They know something. They made it pretty clear that they want me to stop whatever I'm doing and get out of town." "Dad!" Lily said quietly, not looking up from her coloring book. "Tell her about the man who's been watching our house." Jack looked at his daughter in surprise. "What man?" "The one in the blue car," Ben added, as if this should be obvious. "He's been parked across the street every time we've been there this week." Martinez leaned forward. "You've seen someone watching the house?" The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations, then Lily nodded. "He pretends to be reading a newspaper, but he's really watching our windows." Jack felt a chill of fear mixed with pride in his children's observational skills. He had been so focused on the mystery inside the house that he hadn't noticed the surveillance outside it. "Can you describe him?" Martinez asked. "Old," Ben said. "Like older than Dad, but not as old as Mrs. Chen, and he has a big stomach and grey hair. He drives a blue sedan," Lily added. "License plate starts with HDJ." Martinez pulled out a notebook and wrote down the partial plate number. "You two are very good detectives," she said, and the twins beamed with pride. "So what's your professional opinion?" Jack asked. "Am I putting my family in danger by pursuing this?" Martinez was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents again. Then she looked at Jack with the expression he remembered from their days working together, the look she got when she was about to tell someone a truth they didn't want to hear. "Based on what happened to the Morrison family, yes, there's definitely danger," she said. "These documents implicate people in crimes that could still result in serious jail time even after 30 years. And if those same people or their families are still benefiting from the corruption, they have a lot to lose if this becomes public." "But," Jack prompted, sensing there was more. "But," Martinez continued, "you may have already passed the point of no return. If they know you found the documents, walking away now doesn't guarantee your safety. In fact, it might make you more vulnerable." Jack felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "Think about it from their perspective," Martinez explained. "As long as you're actively investigating and potentially preparing to go public, they have to be careful about how they handle you. Any obvious retaliation would only draw attention to what you found. But if you back down and try to disappear quietly, you become a loose end that they might decide to tie up permanently." The implication was clear, and Jack saw the twins stiffen slightly as they processed what Martinez was suggesting. "So what would you do in my situation?" Jack asked. Martinez smiled grimly. "I'd make sure I had enough evidence to make the biggest possible noise if anything happened to me, and I'd make sure that as many people as possible knew about that evidence." "You mean go public with it?" "I mean create a situation where silencing you would cause more problems than leaving you alone would." Jack thought about this strategy, recognizing the logic even as he wrestled with the risk it would entail for his children. "What about jurisdiction?" he asked. "Some of these crimes cross state lines, involve federal construction contracts. Would local law enforcement even be able to handle it?" "You're right to think bigger," Martinez agreed. "This kind of corruption, especially if it's still ongoing, would be of interest to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. And if there's any connection to federal funding or interstate commerce, they'd have clear jurisdiction." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I know someone at the Bureau who specializes in this kind of case, someone I trust to handle it properly." "And you think they'd be interested?" Martinez gestured at the documents. "Jack, this is the kind of case that prosecutors build their careers on, especially if you can connect the historical corruption to ongoing criminal activity." "How would I do that?" "By proving that the structural problems in buildings around Millbrook are still causing harm today. Medical records from the hospital wing that was built with substandard materials, safety reports from the school that had the roof collapse, engineering assessments of the bridge that was closed." Jack felt his excitement building as he began to see the scope of what they might be able to accomplish. It would be like connecting the dots between crimes that happened 30 years ago and harm that's still occurring today. Exactly. And the Morrison family becomes not just historical victims, but people who died trying to prevent ongoing harm to their community. "Dad," Ben said quietly, "if we do this, will the bad men try to hurt us like they hurt Sarah's family?" It was the question Jack had been dreading, but his son deserved an honest answer. "They might try," Jack said carefully, "but we'll be smarter and more careful than the Morrison family was able to be, and we'll have help from people like Detective Martinez and the FBI. Will we still get to live in our house?" Lily asked. Jack looked at Martinez, who shrugged slightly, a gesture that meant the answer was complicated. "I don't know," Jack said honestly. "We might have to stay somewhere else for a while, until the bad men are arrested and can't hurt anyone anymore." The twins absorbed this information with the resilience that children showed when adults were honest with them about difficult situations. "But we'd come back eventually?" Ben asked. "I hope so," Jack said. "The house belongs to us, and Sarah Morrison trusted us to take care of the secrets she hid there. I think we owe it to her to make sure her home becomes a safe place again." Martinez was already making notes about next steps, contacts to call, evidence to gather, precautions to take. But Jack found himself thinking about the sealed metal box they still hadn't examined completely, buried in the garden behind the house. If Harold Morrison had hidden documents in the bathroom, what might he have buried outside? And if they were going to build a case that could finally bring justice for the Morrison family, they needed to make sure they had found every piece of evidence that 30 years of silence had preserved. "There's something else," Jack said. "Something we found in the backyard that we haven't opened yet." Martinez looked up from her notes. "What kind of something?" "A metal box, buried under what used to be a garden. We found it with a metal detector." "And you haven't opened it?" Jack shook his head. "I wanted to wait until I had some idea what we were dealing with. Now I think it's time to see what else Harold Morrison thought was important enough to preserve." Martinez nodded. "I think you're right. But Jack, once we open that box, once we start making official inquiries, there's no going back. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Jack looked at his children, who were watching him with complete trust that he would make the right decision to protect them and honor the memory of another father who had tried to do the same thing 30 years earlier. "Yes," he said, "I'm prepared." But as they left the diner and drove back toward Millbrook, Jack wondered if anyone could ever really be prepared for the moment when doing the right thing required risking everything they cared about most. The metal box had been waiting in the basement since their discovery, wrapped in plastic and sitting on Jack's workbench like a time capsule from a world that no longer existed. Now, with Detective Martinez's contact information in his pocket and a plan forming in his mind, Jack felt ready to open the final chapter of Harold Morrison's desperate attempt to preserve the truth. The twins gathered around as Jack carefully pried open the latched lid. The box had been sealed well enough to keep out moisture and insects, preserving its contents in remarkable condition. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were items that told the story of a family's last days. A stack of photographs showing construction sites, city officials, and meetings that Harold Morrison had apparently documented in secret. Audio cassette tapes labeled with dates and locations, a thick folder of what appeared to be financial records from multiple construction companies. And at the bottom of the box, something that made Jack's hands tremble as he lifted it out. A Millbrook Police Department detective badge and a service revolver wrapped in a cloth evidence bag. "Dad," Lily said quietly, "why would Mr. Morrison have police stuff?" Jack stared at the badge, his mind reeling as puzzle pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The badge belonged to Detective Harold Morrison, not Harold Morrison, the accountant, but Detective Harold Morrison of the Millbrook Police Department. "Because," Jack said slowly, "Harold Morrison wasn't just an accountant who discovered corruption. He was a police detective who was investigating it." The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. A police detective and his family had been murdered to prevent them from exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. This wasn't just about construction fraud. This was about a conspiracy that had included law enforcement officials who had betrayed their sworn duty to protect and serve. "But that means," Ben said, working through the logic with the directness of childhood, "some of the police were bad guys too." "Some of them were," Jack confirmed, feeling sick as he thought about his own years on the force, the colleagues he had trusted, the system he had believed in. He picked up one of the cassette tapes and examined the label, Chief Kelly, October 3, 1969, insurance discussion. Harold Morrison had been recording his conversations with his own police chief. "We need to listen to these," Jack said, though part of him dreaded what they might reveal. The twins helped him set up an old cassette player that Jack had found in the basement, probably left behind by one of the house's previous tenants. The first tape they played was labeled simply October 5, 1969, final recording. Harold Morrison's voice, preserved across 30 years, filled the kitchen with the sound of a man who knew he was running out of time. "If anyone finds this recording, my name is Detective Harold Morrison, badge number 247, Millbrook Police Department. It is October 5th, 1969, and I have reason to believe that my family and I are in immediate danger because of what I have discovered about corruption involving my own department and several city officials. For the past 6 months, I have been documenting evidence of a conspiracy involving Mayor Richard Brennan, Police Chief Thomas Kelly, and Henderson Construction, along with several other local contractors. They have been systematically overcharging the city for construction projects, using substandard materials and falsifying safety inspections. The profits from these fraudulent contracts have been split among the conspirators. But that's not the worst of it. When I tried to report my findings through proper channels, I discovered that the corruption goes all the way to the state level. Officials who should have been investigating these crimes are instead protecting the people committing them. I have been threatened multiple times, both directly and indirectly. Yesterday, Chief Kelly informed me that I was being transferred to a different department, effectively removing me from any investigation that might threaten the conspiracy. When I refused, he made it clear that my family's safety could not be guaranteed if I continued to pursue the matter. I am not a man who gives up easily, but I am first and foremost a father. I have hidden evidence of the conspiracy in multiple locations, trusting that someday someone with more resources and fewer vulnerabilities than I have will be able to use it to bring justice to the people of this community. To my children, Sarah and Michael, if you ever hear this recording, know that everything your father did was because he believed that right and wrong still matter, even when the people who are supposed to enforce the law are the ones breaking it. I hope you will be proud of the choice I made, even if it cost us everything. To whoever finds this evidence, I ask only that you remember that the Morrison family believed that the truth was worth any sacrifice. Use what we preserved to make sure that our community is finally free from the corruption that has infected it for too long." The tape ended with the soft click of the recorder being turned off, leaving the kitchen in a silence that felt heavy with the weight of a dead man's trust. "He was a police detective like you used to be," Lily said quietly. Jack nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that was clogging his throat. Harold Morrison had been exactly like him, a cop who had discovered corruption, a father who had tried to protect his family while doing the right thing, a man who had ultimately paid the ultimate price for his integrity. "Dad," Ben asked, "is that why you stopped being a police detective too?" The question Jack had hoped his children would never ask, the conversation he had been avoiding for years, could no longer be postponed. "Yes," he said simply. "I found out that some of the people I worked with were doing bad things, and when I tried to stop them, they made it impossible for me to keep my job." "Did they try to hurt us too?" Lily asked. Jack thought about the threats that had been made, the pressure that had been applied, the way his marriage had crumbled under the stress of fighting a system that was designed to protect itself rather than serve justice. "Not the same way they hurt the Morrison family," he said carefully. "But they did hurt us. They hurt our family by making it impossible for me to do the job I loved, and by making me doubt whether fighting for what's right was worth the cost." The twins absorbed this information with the seriousness it deserved, and Jack, could see them beginning to understand why the Morrison family's story had affected him so deeply. "But now you get to try again," Ben said with the optimism that children brought to even the most complex situations. "You get to help Sarah Morrison's family by finishing what her dad started." Jack looked at his son, amazed by the clarity with which an 8-year-old could cut through years of adult uncertainty and self-doubt. "Yes," he said, "I get to try again. But this time would be different. This time he wouldn't be a lone detective trying to fight corruption from within a compromised system. This time he would have federal authorities, media attention, and public oversight, all the resources that Harold Morrison hadn't been able to access in 1969. And this time, Jack had something else that Harold Morrison hadn't had. The knowledge of what had happened to another family who had tried to expose the same conspiracy. He could learn from Morrison's mistakes, avoid the isolation that had made the detective and his family vulnerable, and build the kind of public support that would make it impossible for the truth to be silenced again. As Jack rewrapped the police badge and service weapon, he felt the weight of Harold Morrison's legacy settling on his shoulders. 2 police detectives, 30 years apart, connected by their commitment to justice and their love for their children. The difference was that this time, the story wouldn't end with a family disappearing into the darkness. This time, the truth would finally see the light of day, no matter what it cost. "What do we do now?" Lily asked. Jack looked at his children, seeing in their faces the same determination that had driven Sarah Morrison to write her letter and hide her father's secrets. "Now we make sure that Detective Harold Morrison's sacrifice wasn't meaningless," he said. "We make sure the whole world knows what a brave man and his family died trying to tell them." And for the first time since the divorce had shattered his confidence in his own judgment, Jack felt absolutely certain that he was making the right choice. Harold Morrison had trusted that someday someone would find his evidence and have the courage to use it. That someone had turned out to be another cop, another father, another man who believed that protecting children meant more than just keeping them safe. It meant making sure they inherited a world where truth and justice actually mattered. The next 48 hours moved with the accelerating momentum of an avalanche. Detective Martinez had connected Jack with FBI Special Agent Catherine Ross, whose public corruption unit had been investigating similar patterns of construction fraud across the Midwest. When Ross examined Harold Morrison's evidence, she immediately understood its significance. "This is exactly the kind of historical documentation we need to establish a pattern of ongoing criminal enterprise," she explained during their first meeting at the federal building in the state capitol. "If we can prove that the same families and businesses have been engaged in corruption for 30 years, we can build a RICO case that will dismantle the entire network." Jack had left the twins with Sarah for the weekend, explaining only that he was helping with an important police investigation. He hadn't told his ex-wife about the threats or the danger, not wanting to worry her, until he knew more about how the federal authorities planned to proceed. But Agent Ross's next words made it clear that secrecy was no longer an option. "Mr. Harmon, you and your children are going to need federal protection starting immediately," she said. "Once we begin executing search warrants and making arrests, the people you've identified will know exactly where the evidence came from. How long would we need protection? That depends on how many of the original conspirators are still alive and active. But based on what you've uncovered, I'd estimate we're looking at a minimum of several months, possibly longer." Jack felt his carefully constructed new life beginning to crumble. "My children have been through enough disruption. Their parents' divorce, moving to a new house, starting over. I can't put them in witness protection." "You may not have a choice," Agent Ross said gently. "The Morrison family thought they could handle the threats on their own. We both know how that ended." That evening, Jack sat in his rented apartment staring at his phone, trying to find the words to explain to Sarah that their children's lives were about to be turned upside down again. When he finally made the call, her reaction was exactly what he had feared. "You did what?" Sarah's voice carried the kind of controlled anger that Jack remembered from their worst arguments. "You got our children involved in some kind of criminal investigation without discussing it with me first?" "I didn't get them involved," Jack said defensively. "They found the evidence. I'm just trying to do the right thing with what we discovered. The right thing would have been to call the police and let them handle it, not to turn our children into targets for some conspiracy that has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us now. And Sarah, these people killed a family to keep their secrets. If we try to walk away now, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I am not letting you put Ben and Lily in danger because of some misguided need to play hero." The conversation ended with Sarah demanding that Jack bring the children back immediately and threatening to seek emergency custody modification if he didn't. Jack spent the rest of the night pacing his empty apartment, torn between his commitment to Harold Morrison's memory and his responsibility to his own family. By morning, he had made his decision. He called Agent Ross first. "I want to accelerate the timeline. How quickly can we execute the arrests? That depends on how much additional evidence we can gather. The historical documentation is compelling, but we need to connect it to ongoing criminal activity. That means surveillance, wiretaps, financial investigations, all of which take time. We don't have time. The people involved know I found the evidence, and they're pressuring me to back off. If we're going to do this, we need to do it before they decide I'm too much of a threat to leave alone." Agent Ross was quiet for a moment. "There is one possibility. If you were willing to wear a wire and meet with David Walsh or Edward Brennan, we might be able to get them to incriminate themselves, especially if they think you're ready to make a deal." The idea terrified Jack, but it also offered a way to end the threat quickly and definitively. "What would I have to do?" "Convince them that you're willing to sell them the evidence in exchange for a guarantee of your family's safety. Get them talking about what they did to the Morrison family, what they're prepared to do to you, how the corruption network operates today." Morrison. "And if they get suspicious? Then you'll have federal agents close enough to intervene within seconds." "But Jack, I won't lie to you, this carries significant risk." Jack thought about Sarah Morrison's letter, about Harold Morrison's voice on the recordings, about the blood-stained floorboard in the house that was supposed to be his children's safe haven. "I'll do it," he said. The next step was the hardest, explaining to Ben and Lily that their weekend was going to be very different from what they had planned. "I need to meet with the bad men," Jack told them as they sat in the living room of their house, surrounded by renovation materials and memories of happier discoveries. "But I'm going to have help from the FBI agents, and you're going to stay somewhere safe until everything is finished." "Where are we going to stay?" Lily asked. "With your mum. Agent Ross is going to have some police officers watch your mum's house, just to make sure you're protected." Ben was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "Dad, are you scared?" Jack looked at his son, remembering his own father's advice about the difference between courage and fearlessness. "Yes," he said honestly, "I'm very scared. But sometimes being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. It just means you should be extra careful while you do it." "Will you be extra careful?" Lily asked. "I promise." The twins helped him pack up Harold Morrison's evidence, handling each document and photograph with the reverence of children who understood they were touching history. When they found the brass key that had started their investigation, Ben held it up to the light. "This was Sarah Morrison's key," he said. "Now it's our key." "What do you mean?" Jack asked. "She used it to help her family. Now we get to use it to help our family and all the other families that might get hurt if the bad men don't get stopped." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. Somewhere in the process of uncovering the Morrison family's story, his children had learned lessons about courage, sacrifice, and moral responsibility that he had never directly taught them. That afternoon, he drove them to Sarah's house, where federal agents were already setting up surveillance equipment and security protocols. Sarah met them at the door, her anger from the phone call replaced by grim acceptance of the situation they found themselves in. "Be careful, Jack," she said quietly as the twins ran inside to show their mother the pictures they had drawn of the house. "Whatever mistakes we made in our marriage, our children need their father." "I'll be careful," Jack promised. "And Sarah, when this is over, I want to tell you about everything we found, about what the kids did to help solve a 30-year-old mystery, and how proud you should be of who they're becoming." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Just come home safe so you can tell me yourself." As Jack drove back to the house alone, he found himself thinking about Detective Harold Morrison making a similar drive 30 years earlier, preparing for a confrontation he knew he might not survive. The difference was that Morrison had been isolated, without backup, facing a system that was entirely corrupted. Jack had the full weight of the federal government behind him, sophisticated surveillance equipment and agents positioned to intervene at the first sign of trouble. But he also had something Harold Morrison had ultimately lacked: the knowledge of what had happened to a family who had tried to do the right thing without adequate protection. That knowledge would keep him alive long enough to make sure the Morrison family's story finally had the ending they deserved. At the house, Agent Ross and her team were making final preparations for the meeting that would either end the conspiracy or end Jack's life. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the Victorian house that had kept its secrets for 30 years, Jack prepared to honor the trust that a 10-year-old girl had placed in the future. Tomorrow, Sarah Morrison would finally get the justice her family had died trying to achieve. Or Jack Harmon would join them as another casualty of the corruption they had tried to expose. Either way, the silence that had protected the guilty for 3 decades was about to end. The phone call came at exactly 8 o'clock Monday morning, just as Agent Ross had predicted. "Mr. Harmon, this is David Walsh. I trust you've had time to consider our offer." Jack looked at the FBI agents positioned throughout his house, their recording equipment already capturing every word. Agent Ross nodded encouragingly from her position near the kitchen window. "I've been thinking about it," Jack said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "But 50,000 doesn't seem like enough, considering what I found." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What exactly do you think you found, Mr. Harmon?" "I think you know exactly what I found. The question is, how much is it worth to you to make sure it stays buried?" Another pause, longer this time. Jack could almost hear Walsh weighing his options, trying to determine whether Jack was genuinely interested in making a deal or setting some kind of trap. "Perhaps we should meet in person to discuss the details," Walsh said finally. "Somewhere private, where we can speak freely." Jack's heart rate spiked. This was the moment Agent Ross had prepared him for the invitation that would either give them the evidence they needed or put Jack in mortal danger. "I know just the place," Jack said. "The old Morrison house has plenty of privacy. Why don't you come by this evening? Say, 7 o'clock? The Morrison house?" Walsh's voice carried a note of surprise that suggested Jack had chosen better than he knew. 1247 Maple Street. "I think it's appropriate, don't you, given what we'll be discussing?" When the call ended, Agent Ross immediately began coordinating with her team. He agreed to meet at the house. "That's either very good or very bad for us." "Why bad?" Jack asked. "Because if Walsh is willing to return to the scene of his crimes, it might mean he's confident he can handle the situation permanently. We need to be ready for the possibility that this isn't just a negotiation. It could be an ambush." The day passed with agonizing slowness as federal agents transformed Jack's house into a fortress of hidden cameras, microphones, and tactical equipment. Jack tried to focus on the plan they had rehearsed, but his mind kept drifting to his children, safe at their mother's house, but waiting for news that their father was coming home. As evening approached, Agent Ross made one final check of the surveillance equipment. "Remember, Jack, your job is to get them talking about the Morrison family. We need them to admit what they did, how they did it, and whether they're prepared to do the same thing to you. But if at any point you feel like the situation is getting dangerous, Use the safe word, and we'll move in immediately. Jack nodded, checking the tiny microphone concealed in his shirt collar. What if they search me for recording equipment? Then you stick to the story that you're just interested in making money and getting out of town. The hidden cameras will still capture whatever happens. At 6:55 p.m., a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Jack watched from the front window as David Walsh and Edward Brennan got out of the car, both men moving with the careful alertness of people who expected trouble. But it was the third man who emerged from the back seat that made Jack's blood run cold. Tall and heavily built, with the kind of physical presence that spoke of violence as a professional tool, he was clearly not there to participate in negotiations. Jack opened the front door before they could knock, projecting a confidence he didn't feel. "Gentlemen, welcome to the Morrison house. Please, come in." Walsh and Brennan entered cautiously, their eyes scanning the empty rooms and renovation materials. The third man remained by the door, his hand resting casually inside his jacket in a way that left no doubt about what he was carrying. "This brings back memories," Brennan said quietly, looking around the living room where Harold Morrison had once played with his children. "I'm sure it does," Jack replied. "Shall we discuss business?" Walsh pulled out an envelope from his jacket. $100,000, cash. More than enough to start a new life somewhere far from here. Jack made a show of examining the money, while the hidden cameras recorded every detail of the transaction. "Very generous. But I'm curious, why is this worth so much to you? What exactly are you afraid I'll do with what I found?" "We're not afraid of anything," Brennan said sharply. "We're simply businessmen who value our privacy. The same kind of privacy you valued 30 years ago?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Walsh and Brennan exchanged a look that spoke of communications Jack couldn't hear, but could easily interpret. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Harmon," Walsh said carefully. Jack walked to the wall where Sarah Morrison had carved her message, running his fingers along the faded letters. "I'm implying that Detective Harold Morrison found evidence of the same corruption that's still making you money today. And when he tried to expose it, you made sure he and his family disappeared." The silence that followed was broken by the soft sound of the third man's footsteps as he moved closer to Jack's position. "That's a very serious accusation," Brennan said, "and a very dangerous one." "Dangerous for who?" Jack asked, though he could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "For anyone stupid enough to believe that ancient history matters more than their family's safety," Walsh replied. Jack felt a chill of fear, but also a surge of anger that gave him courage. "Is that what you told Harold Morrison? That his children's safety depended on keeping quiet about what he'd found?" Brennan laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Harold Morrison was an idealistic fool who thought being a cop made him untouchable. He learned otherwise." "So you admit you killed him?" "I admit that Harold Morrison made choices that had consequences," Brennan said, "just like you're making choices right now that will have consequences." The third man had moved to a position where he could see both the front and back doors, effectively cutting off Jack's escape routes. Agent Ross and her team would be listening to every word, but Jack wondered if they would be able to intervene quickly enough if the situation deteriorated. "What about Sarah Morrison?" Jack pressed, knowing he needed to get more specific admissions on tape. "What about her brother Michael? What consequences did they face for their father's choices?" Walsh's expression hardened. "Children who grow up in corrupt families learn early that loyalty has its rewards and disloyalty has its costs." "They were 8 and 10 years old," Jack said, his anger now overriding his fear. "They were innocent children." "There are no innocent children in families that threaten the stability of an entire community," Brennan replied coldly. "Sometimes hard choices have to be made for the greater good." Jack realized he was looking into the faces of men who had justified the murder of children by calling it business. The banality of their evil was more terrifying than any dramatic threat could have been. "And now you're prepared to make the same hard choice about my family?" Jack asked. The third man's hand moved slightly inside his jacket, and Jack knew they had reached the point of no return. "That depends," Walsh said, "on whether you're prepared to be reasonable. Take the money, Mr. Harmon, take your children, and move somewhere far away from here. Forget about the Morrison family and their tragic fate. Live your life, and let the past stay buried." "And if I refuse?" Walsh shrugged as if the question were academic. "Then I suppose history will repeat itself. Another family will disappear, and 30 years from now, someone else might find evidence of their fate. But by then, it won't matter to any of us." Jack looked at these men who spoke of murder as casually as they might discuss the weather, and he understood that Harold Morrison had faced this same moment, the choice between accepting corruption and risking everything to fight it. The difference was that Harold Morrison had been alone. Jack was not. "I have a better idea," Jack said, his voice steady despite the armed man standing 10 feet away. "Why don't I show you exactly what Harold Morrison left behind?" Walsh and Brennan followed Jack toward the kitchen, their bodyguard remaining positioned by the front door. Jack led them to the spot where the twins had found the brass key, where Sarah Morrison had carved her message of hope into the wall. "This is where it all started," Jack said, running his fingers along the carved letters. "A 10-year-old girl who believed that someday someone would find her father's evidence and use it to get justice for her family." "Touching," Brennan said sarcastically, "but ultimately meaningless. Whatever Morrison hid died with him 30 years ago." Jack smiled, reaching into his pocket to pull out the brass key. "Did it?" The key caught the light from the overhead fixture, gleaming like a promise fulfilled. Walsh and Brennan stared at it with recognition that confirmed what Jack had suspected. They knew exactly what the key represented. "Where did you find that?" Walsh demanded. "Where Sarah Morrison left it for me to find, along with everything else her father preserved." Jack walked to the basement door, which had been fitted with an old-fashioned lock that the previous owners had installed decades earlier. "Would you like to see?" The brass key slid into the lock as if it had been waiting 30 years for this moment. The door swung open to reveal the basement stairs, and Jack began to descend with Walsh and Brennan close behind. The basement had been transformed since Jack's last visit. Agent Ross and her team had used the space to set up their command center, but they had also recreated something else, a perfect replica of Harold Morrison's hidden evidence cache, complete with documents, photographs, and audio equipment. "My God," Walsh whispered, staring at the display. "It's all here. Everything," Jack confirmed. "Financial records, photographs, audio recordings, and most importantly, Detective Morrison's detailed testimony about how the conspiracy worked and who was involved." Brennan moved closer to the table where the evidence was displayed, his face pale with recognition. "This is impossible. We searched this house for weeks after the Morrison family disappeared. We tore apart every wall, every hiding place." "You searched for evidence hidden by an adult," Jack interrupted. "You never thought to look for evidence hidden by a child who was smarter than all of you combined." The third man had followed them down the stairs, his weapon now openly visible in his hand. The basement suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. "It doesn't matter," Walsh said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You're the only one who knows about this. Once you're gone, the evidence disappears again." "Actually," Jack said, pulling out his cell phone, "several hundred people know about it now." He showed them the screen, which displayed a live video feed being broadcast to social media. The hidden cameras in the basement were streaming everything that was happening to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, with thousands of viewers watching in real time. "Say hello to the world, gentlemen. You're live on the internet." Walsh and Brennan stared at the phone in horror, realizing that their conversation about the Morrison family murders had been broadcast to anyone with an internet connection. "You're insane," Brennan said. "Do you realize what you've done?" "I've done what Harold Morrison died trying to do," Jack replied. "I've made sure the truth can't be buried again." The sound of footsteps on the stairs above them announced the arrival of Agent Ross and her team. The FBI agents moved quickly and professionally, surrounding the three men and securing the basement within seconds. David Walsh, Edward Brennan, you're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering and murder, Agent Ross announced as her agents applied handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. This is entrapment, Walsh shouted. We were set up. You were given every opportunity to walk away, Agent Ross replied calmly. Instead, you chose to threaten a federal witness and confess to multiple felonies on camera. As the agents led Walsh and Brennan upstairs, Jack found himself alone in the basement with Agent Ross and the evidence that Harold Morrison had preserved at the cost of his family's life. Is it over? Jack asked. The immediate threat to your family is over, Agent Ross replied. But this is just the beginning. Based on what we recorded tonight, we'll be able to build cases against dozens of people who were part of the conspiracy. Some of them are still in positions of power, still causing harm to communities across the region. Jack thought about the structural failures in Millbrook, the buildings that had collapsed or been condemned because of corners cut 30 years earlier. How many people might have been hurt because of what they did? We may never know for certain, but tonight you made sure that no one else will be hurt by their crimes. As they emerged from the basement, Jack saw Mrs. Chen standing on her front porch, watching the FBI agents load the suspects into unmarked vehicles. When she saw Jack, she walked across the yard to meet him. Is it finished? She asked quietly. It's finished, Jack confirmed. Sarah Morrison can finally rest in peace. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. I was her friend, you know, before they took her away. I promised her mother I would watch over their house until someone came who could help them. Jack stared at his neighbor in amazement. You've been waiting here for 30 years? I moved here when I got married in 1985, Mrs. Chen replied. My husband thought I was crazy for insisting we buy the house next door to where a family had been murdered. But Sarah Morrison was my dearest friend in childhood. I couldn't let her family be forgotten. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sudden clarity. Mrs. Chen hadn't just been a helpful neighbor, she had been a guardian, watching over the Morrison house and waiting for someone who could finally bring justice for her lost friend. She would be proud of what you and your children did, Mrs. Chen said softly. You found her father's evidence, and you had the courage to use it the way she hoped someone would. As the FBI vehicles disappeared into the night, Jack walked back into the house that had transformed his family's life in ways he never could have imagined. The renovation project that had started as a way to rebuild his relationship with his children had become something much more important, a way to honor the sacrifice of another family and to ensure that their story would never be forgotten. In Sarah Morrison's bedroom, he found the locket that had been among the evidence in the metal box. Inside the heart-shaped pendant was a tiny photograph of the Morrison family, taken during happier days when they had no idea what the future would bring. But there was something else in the locket that Jack hadn't noticed before, a small piece of microfilm containing additional evidence that Harold Morrison had preserved as a final safeguard against the corruption that had destroyed his family. The Morrison family had thought of everything, leaving multiple layers of evidence that would ensure their story could never be completely erased. Even in death, they had continued to fight for justice and truth. Jack slipped the locket into his pocket, knowing that it belonged with the other evidence that would be used to prosecute the remaining members of the conspiracy. But first, he had a phone call to make. Sarah, he said when his ex-wife answered, it's over, we're safe, and the bad guys are in custody. Thank God, Sarah replied, the relief evident in her voice. Are you coming to get the kids? On my way, Jack confirmed. And Sarah, we have a lot to talk about what the kids did to solve this case, and about how proud we should be of who they're becoming. As Jack locked the door of 1247 Maple Street for the last time as a crime scene, he realized that the house would finally be able to become what Harold Morrison had always intended it to be, a home where a family could live safely and happily, protected by the truth rather than threatened by lies. 6 months later, Jack stood in the kitchen of 1247 Maple Street, watching through the window as Ben and Lily played in the backyard, where Harold Morrison had once buried evidence that would change their lives forever. The morning sun streamed through new windows, casting bright patterns across hardwood floors that gleamed with fresh varnish and the kind of care that came from love rather than obligation. The house had been transformed, but not in the way Jack had originally planned. Instead of simply renovating a run-down Victorian, they had restored a home that carried the weight of history and the promise of redemption. Every room told a story, now not just of the family who lived there, but of the family who had died there and the justice that had finally been served in their memory. The trials had been swift and decisive. David Walsh and Edward Brennan had been sentenced to life in prison without parole for their roles in the Morrison family murders. The federal investigation they had triggered had uncovered a web of corruption that reached into 12 states, resulting in over 40 indictments and the recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts and stolen public funds. More importantly, the structural problems in buildings throughout the region were finally being addressed. The school gymnasium that had collapsed in 1985 was being rebuilt to modern safety standards. The bridge that had been closed for decades was finally getting the repairs it had needed since the day it was constructed. The hospital wing that had been built with substandard materials was being completely renovated, ensuring that the patients who depended on it would no longer be at risk. "Dad, look what we found," Ben called from the garden, holding up an old horseshoe that had been buried beneath the tomato plants Jack and the twins had planted in the spring. "Probably left over from when this was farmland," Jack replied, but he smiled at his son's excitement. Ben had developed an insatiable curiosity about hidden things and buried treasures, a passion that had led to several interesting discoveries around their property and a collection of artifacts that now filled a display case in his bedroom. Lily emerged from the house carrying a tray with lemonade and sandwiches. At 9 years old, she had grown into the role of family organizer, keeping track of everyone's schedules and making sure important details didn't get overlooked. She had also become the family historian, maintaining a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about the Morrison case and their role in solving it. "Mrs. Chen is coming over for lunch," she announced, setting the tray on the picnic table Jack had built in the spot where the metal box had been buried. "She's bringing her famous cookies." Mrs. Chen had become an honorary grandmother to the twins, and they had become the children she had never had. The relationship had grown naturally from their shared experience with the Morrison case, but it had deepened into something that enriched all their lives. She taught Lily how to cook traditional Chinese dishes, helped Ben with his math homework, and provided Jack with the kind of parental wisdom that came from decades of life experience. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted Jack's thoughts. Sarah emerged from her sedan, carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing the smile that Jack remembered from their early years together. Their relationship had undergone its own renovation in the months since the case had ended. Not a reconstruction of their marriage, but the building of something new, a partnership focused on their children and grounded in mutual respect rather than romantic love. "Perfect timing," Jack called out. "We were just about to have lunch." Sarah had remarried the month before, a kind and patient man who understood that her relationship with Jack would always be complicated by their shared children and their shared history. But David was also someone who appreciated the importance of family in all its forms, and he had gradually become part of the extended network of people who cared about Ben and Lily's well-being. "How are my favorite detectives?" Sarah asked, hugging the twins as they ran to greet her. "We're not detectives anymore," Ben corrected her seriously. "We're historians." "Historians?" Sarah looked to Jack for clarification. "They're working on a book about the Morrison family," Jack explained, "with help from Mrs. Chen and some of the other neighbors who remember what happened." Lily nodded seriously. "We want to make sure people remember Sarah Morrison and her family, not just the bad things that happened to them, but the good things they did when they were alive." The book project had started as a school assignment, but had grown into something much more ambitious. The twins had interviewed dozens of people who had known the Morrison family, collected photographs and documents, and were creating a memorial that would ensure the family's story would be preserved for future generations. Mrs. Chen arrived as they were finishing lunch, carrying a container of her legendary almond cookies and a manila envelope that she handed to Jack with ceremonial solemnity. "The last piece of the puzzle," she announced. Inside the envelope was a letter, written in Sarah Morrison's careful 10-year-old handwriting and addressed to whoever lives in our house someday. Jack read the letter aloud. "Dear future family, if you are reading this, it means someone found my daddy's evidence and used it to catch the bad men who hurt us. I hope that means our house can finally be a happy place again. I wanted you to know that we loved this house very much. We were happy here, even when scary things were happening. My daddy built the tree house in the backyard, and my mum planted the rose garden by the front porch. My brother Michael carved his initials in the big oak tree, and I buried my favorite doll under the lilac bush so she would always be part of our home. I hope your family will be as happy in our house as we were. I hope you will take care of the garden and the tree house and all the places where our love is still hiding. Thank you for helping my daddy's truth finally come out. Maybe now other families won't have to be scared the way we were. Love, Sarah Morrison, age 10, October 1969. P.S. There's a time capsule buried under the front steps with pictures and letters from our family. Someday, when you want to remember us, you can dig it up and see what we were like when we were happy." The silence that followed Jack's reading was filled with the weight of a child's love and hope, preserved across decades and finally delivered to the family she had trusted would someday live in her home. "Should we look for the time capsule?" Ben asked quietly. Jack looked around at the faces of the people who had become his extended family, his children, his ex-wife, Mrs. Chen, who had waited 30 years to see justice done, and the neighbors who had gathered to share in the completion of Sarah Morrison's story. "Yes," he said, "I think it's time." They found the time capsule exactly where Sarah Morrison had said it would be, buried in a metal box beneath the front steps. Inside were photographs of the Morrison family during happier times, letters between the children and their grandparents, school artwork and report cards, and all the small treasures that a family accumulates when they believe their future is secure. But it was the final item in the box that brought tears to everyone's eyes, a family photograph with a note on the back, written in Harold Morrison's handwriting. "For the family who will someday live in our home, may you find the happiness here that we were blessed to know. And may you always remember that love is stronger than fear and truth is more powerful than any lie." That evening, after the neighbors had gone home and the twins had fallen asleep, Jack sat on the front porch of 1247 Maple Street with Sarah, looking at the house that had taught them all so much about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of fighting for what's right. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Getting involved in something so dangerous?" Jack thought about the question seriously. The past 6 months had been difficult. Death threats from conspiracy sympathizers, media attention that had disrupted their privacy, legal proceedings that had required hundreds of hours of testimony and preparation. But they had also been the most meaningful months of his life. "No," he said finally, "I think about Harold Morrison sometimes and what his life might have been like if someone had been brave enough to help him when he needed it. I think about Sarah Morrison and how much faith it took for a 10-year-old girl to believe that someday someone would find her father's evidence and care enough to use it." He paused, looking at the house that had become both their home and their legacy. "Our children learned something that most kids never get the chance to learn, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to stand up for what's right. That's a lesson that will serve them well for the rest of their lives." Sarah nodded, understanding the truth of what he said. "They're proud of what they did, And I'm proud of what you did to protect them while you honored the Morrison family's memory. As the evening settled over Millbrook, Jack felt a peace that he hadn't known since before his divorce, before his crisis of faith in the system he had served, before he had started to doubt whether fighting for justice was worth the personal cost. The Morrison family had paid the ultimate price for their belief that truth was more important than safety, but their sacrifice had not been meaningless. It had changed the lives of everyone it touched, creating ripples of justice and courage that would continue long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. In the end, 1247 Maple Street had become exactly what Harold Morrison had intended it to be when he built it in 1962, a home where a family could live safely and happily, protected by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. The brass key that had started their journey now hung in a place of honor on the kitchen wall, a reminder that some doors, once opened, lead not just to hidden rooms, but to hidden truths that have the power to change the world. And in the backyard, where Sarah Morrison had once hidden her father's evidence, Ben and Lily's laughter echoed through the evening air as they played games that would have been familiar to children from any generation, games of hide and seek, of discovery and adventure, of growing up in a world where their parents had made sure that truth and justice still mattered. The Morrison family was finally at peace, and the Harmon family was finally at home.